Welcome to Café on Tampa Online this afternoon. I've got Matthew Richter, who spent part of his time growing up in Tampa and now is in the City of Seattle Arts Department. And Matthew, tell us about yourself and tell us about the Arts Department in Seattle, please.
Bill, thanks for having me. Hi, Tampa. Yeah, so I have a job that's unique in the country. Seattle is the first city in the U.S. to invest in a body of work around cultural space, around art space. And I'm the cultural space liaison, job that I've had for about 7 years, and have built it out into a team within the arts office and interdepartmentally as well. The work, as with so much in the last 2 months in this country, on this planet, has become sort of immediately obsolete, and also critically relevant and central to a recovery strategy. As Bill mentioned, I largely grew up in Tampa and moved to Seattle in 1990. Right as Seattle was, the attention of the world was turning to Seattle, really. Spent 25 years in the arts and cultural world here on the nonprofit side. And then when the opportunity existed to create this new body of work at the City of Seattle, jumped at it. Had sort of unintentionally at first, and then more and more intentionally found myself at this intersection of arts and culture and real estate over and over again. As is true, I think when you're fully in the intersection, you're not exactly sure if you're on Arts and Culture Street or Real Estate Avenue. And the work has landed very firmly in the middle of those two.
Did you study arts in school?
Yeah, I studied performing arts in school and have continued to work in the theater and direct sort of large spectacle type shows over the years. In fact, I'm doing a Zoom later today for the University of Washington's drama department about a recent collaboration.
Oh, great. Can you explain to us, there are and will be arts fans watching this, but can you just tell us why the arts are important and why the City of Seattle spends so much? I mean, you've got what, 5 or 6 or more people in your department. Why is it so important to Seattle, and why should it be important to Tampa and Tampa Bay?
So we're actually a 40-person department, 40. We're roughly $15 million a year department. And it's interesting that I mentioned that number only because that scale is driven not by the importance that we as the city or electeds place on arts and culture, but it's driven by revenues generated by the arts and cultural sector. So we survive on what we call the admissions tax, which is a 5% tax levied against any for-profit commercial ticket that you buy. You go and see Star Wars, 5% of your ticket price goes to the admissions tax, which supports our office. So the scale of our office is really a reflection of the scale of the arts and cultural, the entertainment sector in Seattle. The mission drivenness of it comes back to a couple of things. One, a strong belief that it is the cultural life of a neighborhood, the cultural life of a city that brings people together, that brings visitors, residents, workers together around a common experience and a basis for interacting with one another. 2, we bring the arts interdepartmentally to pretty much every project and program that will allow us to sit at the table in Seattle. Our director, Randy Engstrom, talks about the arts as the how. The arts is not the what that you're after, it's the how of every other thing that the city does. It's the how of community development. It's the how of engaging community around transportation issues, around housing issues, around affordability issues for commercial affordability. The arts are the key that can unlock a lot of these discussions that aren't necessarily based in arts and culture.
You opened up so many doors that we could talk about just now, but
well, let me open up. I'm sorry, Bill. Let me open up one more specific to the cultural space work. So we've done a lot of analysis of mapping of cultural space in town and analysis of urban vibrancy, urban vitality. These V words that we use to measure how cities are doing that ultimately don't mean anything, right? But what we found are these correlations between the presence of cultural space and these measures of vitality. So a block with a cultural space on it versus an equivalent commercial block in Seattle without a cultural space on it is twice as likely to have an outdoor seating permit. It's 3 times as likely to have photos uploaded to social media from that block. hours of businesses and hours of cell phone usage are extended into the evenings and on weekends. There's a measure called walk score. That's the real estate measure of how walkable a neighborhood is. The presence of a cultural space gives you a 9-point bump in walk score. That's out of 100. The valuation of properties adjacent to or above cultural spaces rises on average 15%. Versus a block without a cultural space. And so again, there's that very market-driven measure of why arts and culture and cultural spaces are important.
Do you all do an annual report on that? Is there somewhere that our viewers could find that report?
I can email you the document, the PDF that presents all that data. It's also represented in a website called Spacelab Northwest. That's Spacelab, SPACELAB, nw.com. And it's a GIS mapping system, geographic information system, where you can layer the cultural spaces mapping that we've done, and then see demographic data, economic data, health data, all sorts of different census-based data and other information layered on top of that.
So two of the other things that we have heard from the arts community here, one is that the best and brightest workers in tech companies are artists in their spare time. That's what they would like to be doing full time, but they during the day write program or work in tech companies, and then at night they participate in the arts. So that's one. It's not what they say is it's not just an amenity, but they won't come to a community that doesn't have the arts. And maybe with Microsoft and Amazon, and others, you've experienced that. And then another thing is that we've got artists who are there's a guy, Mark Ailing, over in St. Pete. He produces sculptures. He sells for $1,500, $250,000, and he has a team of 9 to 10 people that manufacture these things. He's really a high value add manufacturing company, bringing lots of money into our region.
Yeah.
So do you all track that kind of thing too?
We do. I mean, a lot of the return to urbanism that's been driven by companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook, who want to relocate in urban centers and not into the suburbs, the way that Microsoft did when it was launching, 30 years ago plus, is being hung on the amenity that they pitched to their workforce of live in one of these cultural hubs of the U.S. They're really selling employment at these large tech hubs on the idea of an engagement with the cultural sector in town. Beyond that, too, we know from surveys of PR firms and surveys of the tech companies themselves, the growth industry, the skills that they're looking for and will be looking for when AI takes over a lot of the white collar jobs that have held off mechanization, are around creativity. It's not around knowing this coding language or that coding language. It's not around the ability to build this thing or take that other thing apart. It's about the ability to creatively imagine something that doesn't exist. To take a set of inputs and create a new and unique output from them. That is something that doesn't get taught in math class. It gets taught in art class, and it gets encouraged by the cultural life of the city.
One of the things we're talking about here is that if a friend of mine at Accenture says they have 60,000 software robots who are automating white collar, office jobs that are process oriented, and then AI might take over some of the higher thinking jobs. And so just like the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing took over blue collar jobs, we might see millions of white collar jobs wiped out. And so we're talking about if the arts and creativity really is the bleeding edge of where the economy should go, and if we should be teaching our kids about the arts, because it's the only way they'll have jobs in the future if AI takes over everything. Are you guys having a similar conversation? Does that sound accurate or not?
Yeah, one of the emerging bodies of work in our office is called the Creative Advantage, and it's about returning arts education into the elementary and secondary school systems. It's a partnership with the school district. It's funded again through our office and through philanthropy. And it is about encouraging the skills that we know that we're being told by the hiring firms are going to be central to employment when these kids are joining the workforce. And those are around creative skills. Those are around music. Those are around film. Those are around theater and art. And not because they're looking for theater directors to hire at Google, but they're looking for people who can think creatively about problem solving.
Yeah, and I don't know if I told you, but I lived in Singapore 5 years, and even 30 years ago, they were investing heavily in the arts because Asia used to be the manufacturing base, and now they're creating products and creating innovation, and so we need to make sure we stay ahead of that. The U.S. has always been full of disruptors, and Seattle is a great example. Somebody posted online about the help of the corporate sector. So you have a few huge tech companies there. Are they very involved in partnering with the city or investing in the arts?
Yeah. Um, Seattle's corporate sector has been a little slow on the uptake around philanthropy. And while I mean, clearly, the Gates family created the Gates Foundation with partners, and it became a global leader in philanthropy. Very little of that money is spent in Seattle. Very little of it is spent on local philanthropy. Paul Allen and Vulcan and Paul G. Allen Foundation have been enormously influential as an individual and as an individual company. The others less so, and I think that in terms of contributing to the tax base, no, that is an area where Seattle and Washington State in general are consistently rated as having the most regressive tax structure in the U.S. So we have no means of capturing any of the wealth that's been generated here, either through, we have no income tax, and there's no corporate tax on some of the largest players in town.
Are there any partnerships between the tech sector? So in Florida, the legislature has mandated that universities must partner with the corporate sector. What they mean is directly collaborate to train jobs today, or develop products for today. And some of them are doing innovations for the future. And a lot of that, unfortunately, is just based around STEM. And just another little plug, the arts community, when you ask over here, they all say, well, you need to add A in. What some of us have been saying is get rid of that altogether and talk about how creativity and innovation, analytical ability is the future. So any thoughts about that? How does the intersection of arts, the universities, and the private sector work on innovating new ideas?
There hasn't been that sort of mandate, but you do see a lot of corporate philanthropy and corporate involvement in arts and culture. That STEAM frame of adding the A into STEM is something that absolutely has caught on here. And I think you hear STEAM more than you hear STEM in talking in education circles here in town. I also will admit some of this is outside of my lane in terms of the economic development relationships that the city has in the corporate world, and I don't want to misstate or misstep.
So I'll get back into your lane. Sorry about that, but
No,
I wanted to ask lots of questions. And by the way, I should thank Neil Gobioff and Jeff Tucker, who helped set this up, and also your parents who may be watching too. They're big philanthropists and have been very big supporters of the arts in Tampa and Tampa Bay. So thank you to them.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we've heard, and Neil has done a lot of research with artists, one of the things that we've heard is that we need to develop our grassroots art movement. So we have the institutional art groups that all need help right now because of the COVID-19. But they had big plans for the future before that. But we also need to help the grassroots movement. And a couple of the things affecting the grassroots movement are studio space and living space, affordable living space. So there's big discussions going on throughout our region, throughout our state about affordable housing, which includes workforce housing and also artist housing. So we're relying on these folks to create for us and innovate and entertain us during times when we have to sit at home, like they have been. Where are they going to live and where are they going to work? And that really is your wheelhouse, right? Tell us about how Seattle approaches that, and tell us what you do to address that issue, please.
Sure, thank you. The recognition of the ecosystem, I think, is what you're getting to and what Neil is getting to in their foundation's work as well. The recognition that the very top of the ecosystem is maybe the most visible, part of the iceberg analogy, if you wanted to use that, but that there is, at the grassroots level, as you say, much more activity, much broader activity, and much more representative activity of community. One of the implications of institutional racism is that the part of the iceberg that's visible above the waterline is typically the white institutional part of the iceberg, and that typically what is kept below the waterline, what is underinvested, what is underrecognized, are communities of color and cultural communities that are struggling to be a part of an ecosystem and fighting against a barrier of entry at that waterline that often is impermeable, right? When we talk about an ecosystem, it's often not a functional ecosystem where the membrane between public and generative, sort of underneath the surface, is not permeable. That's exacerbated by the fact that Seattle has grown faster than any other large US city. And while I'm not familiar very well with Tampa's growth numbers, you have a positive growth number, you're not losing people. And what we found through a lack of planning and maybe a lack of understanding was that there was no way for the capacity to grow as quickly as the population grew. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna share a screen and share a couple of slides that demonstrate sort of where some of this work comes from. And I'm getting a notice that screen sharing has been disabled by the host. While we potentially figure that out, Seattle has more tower cranes, those big lattice-shaped cranes working than any other city in the United States. Here we go. I'm going to share this. I'm sorry to slow us down with a bit of tech.
And just so everybody knows who may be watching, Café on Tampa is a bit wonkish. We like digging into issues and bringing information to the public. It's kind of the democratization of information. So we wanted to dig deeply into this for anybody who's interested in the arts. This is a fun conversation.
And I can race through this part as well. So these are tower cranes. There are more of them working in Seattle right now than any other city in the US. There are 57 by the last count. That's more than San Francisco, and it's more than New York City, and it's more than New York City and San Francisco combined. So we are far and away the fastest growing large city in the US. That's borne out by data over the course of the last decade. We grew by 115,000 people, nearly 20% over the course of the last decade. The bottom left graph there is the growth of Seattle since its inception. The two red rectangles that I've drawn are around the current growth rate. And you'll notice that the steepness of that graph, the steepness, of that line is matched only one other time, and it's around the turn of the century, about 110 years ago, when Seattle grew just as quickly and incorporated 5 suburban towns that are now just part neighborhoods of Seattle. We built an electrical system, we built a water system, we built a rail system. We completely revolutionized this town the last time we were growing this quickly. The upper right demonstrates that this is not just a Seattle situation, this is a global situation. Since the inception of cities, since Ur and Mesopotamia, more people have been living in cities each year than live in rural areas each year. And the urban population has been growing in the world while the rural population relative to it has been shrinking. Those two lines finally converged in 2007. So within the last 15 years, we have become an urban species for the first time globally. So again, these are issues that impact cities around the world. Seattle's population growth down there in the bottom right, I've shown my math for those who want to see it, but essentially we add a person every 24 minutes. Since this conversation began, someone moved to Seattle, and that's net. That includes the folks who moved away from Seattle. The ability to add housing for those people grows by a housing unit every 65 minutes. So you take those two numbers, a person moves to Seattle roughly every 20 minutes, and we create a housing unit roughly every hour. How are we going to do anything but end up with the highest, the third highest homeless population in the United States, one of the highest per capita homeless populations in the world? 12,000 people a night live unhoused in Seattle every night. Those two numbers right there show it. It's not about addiction, it's not about mental health, it's about the fact that demand is growing at 3 times the rate roughly that supply is growing. And so that impacts price. And then all of a sudden, we get to decide who gets a housing unit by lining us up by how rich we are.
For anybody who's interested about Tampa, the latest official number just for the city of Tampa is there's a shortage of 20,000 homes, but they tell us that 30,000 people have given up And so there's actually 50,000 people who are looking for homes that they can afford.
Yeah, it's predictable. The one number that I don't show there is kind of the more the less easy one to show with the math, which is that the growth of what we typically think of as potential cultural space, commercial space, ground floor commercial space in these buildings doesn't grow at all, right? The amount of commercial ground floor commercial space you can create in a 1-story building is the exact same as the amount of ground floor commercial space you can create in a 30-story building. And so as we increase density in this town, we're actually, and we're not increasing housing units quickly enough. And I should say that's as fast as Seattle has ever built housing units. We are growing, as that tower crane number shows, faster than ever before, and we're still not able to keep up. The commercial space, the potential art space, the ground floor space isn't growing at all. I adore this picture. This is the gentry. When we talk about gentrification, we're talking about the gentry moving in. And when the gentry move to your neighborhood, a lot of people think of it as winning the urban renewal jackpot. When the gentry move in, the caliber of restaurant and retail grows in a neighborhood. The graffiti is painted over more quickly. The crosswalks are custom painted and curb bulbs show up and historic streetlights show up on the neighborhood. The dumpsters that might have been in front of businesses disappear. They move around to the back, or they're done away with. Dog parks show up everywhere. From the dog's perspective, the arrival of the gentry in the neighborhood is a very positive thing. And one of the things I love about this image in particular is that it is taken from the fox's perspective. And from the fox's perspective, this is a much more menacing picture. From the perspective of the REIT, the Real Estate Investment Trust, the growth in property value is a very positive thing. From the perspective of the small cultural space commercial tenant that might be on a month-to-month arrangement, this is a much more menacing picture. This is a much more dangerous thing to their survival. It increases occupancy costs, both through the rental rate and through the triple net costs, the taxes and whatnot that are passed through. It shortens their site control. Typically, organizations that are able to get 5 and 10-year leases are going to 1-year leases and going month to month. And it is the view of this picture from the more vulnerable perspective that sets up all of the work that we're doing around cultural space, right? So we are unapologetic about siding with those who are being pushed by these pressures, by these development pressures. And it's because we know that these pressures push disproportionately. We know that they don't push equally. We know that they push harder on low-income communities, on cultural communities, on communities of color. And so we have framed all of this work up around a series of values that reflect that those beliefs and that buy-in. Keep race in the room, recognize over and over again the institutional racism that creates disproportionate pressures on different communities. Recognize that the assets aren't always financial. There are assets in community that we can recognize and evaluate. Always be learning. Don't presume to know, or don't presume even that that dominant cultural points of view are correct. Build community ownership, and we mean that literally. Build the opportunities for ownership in community of real estate, of real property. And then who decides is around creating clear pathways for community input into these structures and into these conversations. And so everything that we have done here in town is about addressing that growth situation. One of the things that we did first off when we created this body of work was we created a report called the CAP report, 30 ideas for the creation, activation, and preservation of cultural space. And they were super wonky ideas around FAR bonuses and slight code tweaks to make the development of cultural space easier for those who are already predisposed. And some of them were much broader approaches to how we think about community development and how we think about processes within the city. And so it's a document that, of the 30, Seattle has worked on, has finalized, I think, a dozen of them, maybe it's 13. And there are other cities who have copied the document and used it as a template. And it was very much presented as, here's 30 ideas. A lot of these will work for Seattle. Some of them may work for Portland. Some of them may work for Atlanta. Some of them may work for Tampa.
I know you sent me that document before, but if you don't mind, when you send the other document you reference, if you could send both, and I'll upload them underneath the video so folks can
Yeah,
see.
great.
So how many units of housing have you built since this program has been going? And is it artists only? And is there studio space for them also? How does it work?
So the city hasn't actually developed the housing units. We've tried to serve as a matchmaker and again, through incentives, encouraging the private sector to develop a lot of this housing and a lot of this space. The city has invested directly in creating a lot of the ground floor cultural space, both in city-owned buildings and now just starting to in some privately held buildings as well. So we developed 18,000 square feet of cultural space on the third floor of a 100-year-old train station. We developed 5,000 square feet of cultural space in a new power substation, Seattle City Light electrical power substation.
And who pays for that? How do you get, where does the money come from?
In the example of the train station space, that was debt financed through a bond issuance, and the arts office itself is paying that debt service against that bond issuance. In the example of the power station, the Denny substation, that's a more nuanced one where the city needed a street vacation. We combined 2 blocks into 1 mega block to do the substation, and in order to get that street vacated, that street knocked down, developed as private space, we had to both buy it with cash and provide public benefit. And so the public benefit that the city provided in exchange for taking that street out of the right of way was the creation of this 5,000 feet of space.
One of the worries about housing, the mayor here calls it housing affordability instead of affordable housing, because affordable housing is a specific category. But let's say you build, one of the pushes here is to build tiny apartments in downtown that maybe have few or no parking spaces because millennials or Generation Z would want to move there. But what's to stop that property from escalating in price just like everything else?
Yeah. Well, you can create covenants on it, and the city of Seattle does create covenants on affordability. Some of them are permanent. They go with the building as long as the building exists and transcends sales. And some of them are term limited. Some of them are more about will provide development incentives for the creation of childcare facilities, preschool. I think there's a 12-year incentive built into that. And then again, some of them are more permanent. Our strategy from the arts office is always about stacking affordability strategies. And so we don't want to go in and just create art space on the ground floor of a market rate, high-end building, residential building. We want to go in and create affordable cultural space alongside affordable commercial space for local small business, alongside affordable housing for low-income residents, alongside affordable arts generative space, the way a group like ArtSpace creates.
Somebody asked if you could please define cultural space.
Yeah, it's funny, when this work started, we needed to come up with a definition of what we were talking about related to the Space Lab Northwest project, the inventory of cultural space. And I really thought I'd go online and Google cultural space definition and just Frankenstein together a half dozen definitions that I found online. And I could not find a single definition of what we were talking about online. And so we really developed it in a very community responsive way around, what do we mean? We mean presentation space, and presentation space means everything from theaters and museums and galleries to record shops and bookstores. It's where you share out the cultural product with the public. We mean the space where you make it. We mean the rehearsal rooms and the artist studios and the recording studios and the sound stages, the generative space for artists. We mean the arts educational space. We mean the USF arts programs. We mean the arts training storefronts, the painting schools, the paint your own pottery spaces. We mean the suppliers of the means of production. We mean the photography stores and the art supply stores, the yarn shops even. Right. We mean the cultural community spaces, the community centers and different spaces where people gather. And ultimately what we landed on was a very exhaustive list and the caveat at the end of it's like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. It's very difficult to define, but you sure know it when you see it. And
Well,
so we,
one of the organizations that has approached some folks in Tampa is called Art Space, and they said that there are 3 or 4 facilities in Seattle that have been developed. Could you? And I think a couple of them might be watching today. Can you explain how that works and how a group like that could be a partner for a city?
yeah, ArtSpace out of Minneapolis is a fantastic national organization that creates permanently affordable live workspace and commercial space for artists and arts organizations. They've got 3 incredibly popular projects here in town, and then another one, a 4th one in a near north suburb, um, creating this alchemy of low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, Office of Housing, local Office of Housing money, HUD money, and philanthropy. They bring together a whole slew of players in a capital stack to create these buildings that have waiting lists. The buildings in Seattle, anyway, have waiting lists that are literally 3 times longer than the building's own capacity. People stay on these waiting lists for years in order to have access to some of these spaces. They're beautifully designed, beautifully built, 15-foot tall, light, airy spaces that are designed as live work spaces. And both the commercial space and the residential space above have permanent affordability built into them that are a fraction of market rate. And I don't want to.
If I remember correctly, I might not get my numbers exactly right. Apologies to anybody. But the Warehouse Arts District in St. Pete has like 50 plus artists in workspace, makerspace, and I think they have a waiting list of about 600, and that's just in St. Pete. And
Yeah,
Tampa,
great.
huge list of people that want space.
Yeah.
And
Again, it's that part of the iceberg that is unseen, and that typically is far more diverse and far more representative of community than what you see above the waterline.
let me ask you also before we got on this interview, you talked about retail space. So if with the whole COVID-19 thing, it could be that some retail space won't be used anymore. It could be that some office spaces won't be used as people decide they like to work from home. And what were your ideas related to that?
Well, the program that I was working on just before coming to the city was called Storefront Seattle, and it was a recession era 2010 to 2013 um, program designed to activate empty retail space throughout Seattle. That we were looking at a 25 to 30% vacancy rate towards the tail end of the recession, in the heart of and coming out of the recession. COVID has accelerated this conversation. The question that arose then was, if we continue to mandate the creation of ground floor retail space and new projects, which I think is the right thing to do, but we also continue to uh, grow out of the need for bricks and mortar retail space, what ultimately is going to be the use that we put on these ground floors? It can't just be more office space or more living space where people drop the blinds and cut themselves off from the street. The whole point, one of the points of the creation of that space and the amount of glazing, the amount of glass that you put across it, is to make the built environment more porous, more permeable. The idea that these buildings aren't these canyon walls on either side of a public space, but that they are a part of the public space. You can transcend the facades of these buildings, right? You can literally go in and buy something, or browse, or look through the window, or engage somehow with the building. So these spaces have always served 3 functions, right? They've been income drivers for the building. You charge rent for them. They've provided benefit to the people or organizations or companies that are in them. It gives you a space to sell your widget, and it provides a benefit for the community, for the walking public. It creates a relationship with the built environment, porousness. It tries to deconstruct the sense of alienation that urban environments can create. What's next down there? So as we're doing more, clearly we can survive on a lack of bricks and mortar retail. We've been doing it for 3 months here in Seattle, where I haven't been inside of a store in probably 2 months of that. We the more developers I talk to about it, the more I hear that ground floor retail is really thought of in pro formas less as an income driver and more as an amenity for the building. So the same way you design in some gym space on the 7th floor for everybody to go and use the gym, or a barbecue deck up on the roof that no one's paying for, you're paying for it in the extra dime per foot that you're paying for your apartment. It's an amenity generated for the building. Can ground floor retail be a similar amenity for the building and less of an income driver? What is it that serves those three needs still? What is it that still serves the need of the folks who need, for whatever reason, to sell a widget or to engage with community, need to be on a ground floor connected to a sidewalk? What is it that serves the needs of the property owner, the building owner? And what is it that serves the needs of the walking public, the community walking by the space? That question's wide open, and some of the smartest, most interesting people who I know are thinking about that question right now. What's next for all of this space, these billions of square feet that we've created nationally and nationwide and worldwide?
Yeah, well, you find studies on that, please send it, because the other thing we know is that you talked about gentrification. We know that people want to live and work near art, and why is it that that people keep following art? Because they want to live around it. Hey, yeah. We're about out of time. Want to thank everybody for setting this up. I think Neil Gobioff is trying, and Gobioff Foundation are trying to set up a time for you to come in person. Actually, you were supposed to have done that tomorrow, but because of the safer at home rules, you couldn't do it. But we thank you for doing this online and look forward to seeing you in the future. Any final thoughts or words?
No, Bill, thank you so much. I do look forward to coming back to Tampa and engaging with what you guys have going on there. We have always thought of cities like San Francisco as being on the same highway, headed in the same direction, and they're about 10 miles ahead of us in terms of dealing with some of these growth issues. Our relationship to other cities, both ahead and at different points along the continuum of growth, I think are really interesting, and how we can create a network of resiliency through these similar cities and growing cities is one of the most exciting things to me about working for government.
Well, we appreciate your help, and we're gonna lean on your Tampa roots to get you to help answer some questions for us in the future with the arts community. So thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for watching. Take care.
Right on. Thank you. I'll be back.